Hello, welcome to the Spotlight. The war in Ukraine has been working to Russia's advantage. Even though the 100-day milestone has come and gone, Ukrainian forces have been unable to push back the Russians, even though they have been resisting them. Nevertheless, the U.S. President Joe Biden has approved another $1 billion in arms sales for Ukraine, as 3 European leaders have arrived in Kiev to support President Zelensky. In the Spotlight, we will analyze different aspects of this war and why the push for diplomacy remains elusive. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Journalist and political commentator Fred Weir joins us from Moscow. We also have journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnitch, who joins us from Belgrade. Welcome to you both. Let me first start with you, Fred Weir, where we are going to take a look at the latest, I guess, tranche of military aid coming from the U.S. in the form of $1 billion worth, a package that includes shipments of what's been said additional howitzers, ammunition, and coastal defense systems. Russia says that this is not going, it's useless, based on the latest statement coming from Russia. And of course, the amounts at this point are astronomical for the U.S. to have helped Ukraine. Why is that not helping Ukraine on the ground, do you think?
I think the key problem there in the Donbass for Ukraine is that the Russians are using classical Soviet military tactics, grinding down their regular army. I mean, it is a fact, which was not clearly noticed in the beginning of this war when the Russians tried to surround Kiev and hoped, I guess they hoped, that they could solve all their Ukraine problems in one fell swoop. They realized that wasn't going to happen. The Ukrainians really did show a lot of courage and determination. But it was by political decision that the Russians pulled back from that direction, got on trains and moved through the Kharkiv, Izium space to the Donbass. And they have now 3 fronts in which they are trying to grind down and surround the Ukrainian army, which is the bulk, as I said, of the regular army. It's estimated now at about 70,000 men, heavily fortified, in dwindling positions, and they've run out of their Soviet-era artillery, which uses 152 millimeter ammunition, which means that the new Western artillery that's coming in, not in nearly sufficient quantities, but it uses 155 millimeter shells, which means all the ammunition has to be imported as well. They can't use any existing stockpiles they have. So there are a lot of things happening there that are bad for Ukraine, I guess, but I think horrific casualties are probably the main one. Ukraine is really suffering terribly. The Russians are too. Neither side will talk officially about this, but the casualties in this war are horrific. They are just terrible. It just beggars the imagination that this is happening. But nowadays, the numbers clearly do favor the Russians to defeat the Ukrainians there in the Donbass.
Okay, well, John Bosnitch, there are comparisons being made here in terms of the money that's being spent and the outcome of it. First of all, there's a wide difference between what the Pentagon has said, which the U.S. has committed $5 billion, but yet other sources are talking about how there's been a proposed $33 billion in U.S. aid for Ukraine. Nevertheless, which is what is said to be worth more than half of what Russia spends on its military for the year 2021. Nevertheless, with all these equipment coming in, and whether the Ukrainians know how to use it or not is another question. The immediate question comes as to why then is Ukraine losing this war?
Well, first of all, it's one thing to give equipment to the Ukrainian forces. It's another thing to have them to know how to use it, to have the tactical training for the use of that equipment in a defensive manner, and also to develop the entire delivery infrastructure for that equipment to the front and protect it from Russian airstrikes. I've got 4 journalist colleagues in the conflict zone, 2 of them on each side of the front, and they're giving me very, very negative reports about the Ukrainian military capabilities. They're reporting that today the Russian forces eliminated a large number of donated T-72 tanks. Those were probably delivered from Poland. It's a possibility that they were all destroyed on the train lines. I've received information from an English intelligence officer with whom I share intelligence that the Ukrainian armed forces don't have any capability to hold out longer than another 4 to a maximum of 5 weeks. I've received other intelligence that secret pre-peace talks are already being conducted unofficially between Ukraine, the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev, the Russian government, and neutral facilitators on the borders of Moldova. That implies that the end is near and that Ukraine, the Kiev regime, is attempting to cut its losses. And the final thing is, I've just received a report from the reporters who submitted their report to Der Spiegel in Germany that the situation is even worse than the first report of 4 to 5 weeks resistance. That's the way things look from all sides in the conflict now.
Yeah, you said that you have intel. Do you have any intel you'd like to share with us, aside from the ones that you just announced?
Well, the most important intel is the one that is the information that I'm receiving from an English intelligence officer who's directly connected to his correspondents in the field, and those are secret reports, and not one of his reporters is giving a positive outlook. This implies and suggests that, and it correlates with the information I'm getting from the Russian side and from the Donetsk self-defense forces, that the recent all-out shelling of civilian targets in Donbass by Ukrainian artillery resembles Hitler's terror bombing of London just before he gave up the aerial war against Great Britain in World War II. In other words, trying to torture the civilian population to the maximum degree, it implies that the Ukrainian forces are exactly following Hitler's tactics.
Okay. This has made news. I'm not too sure what to make of it, which is why I'm going to ask you a question, Fred Weir, and that is the fact that you have the leaders of Germany, France, and Italy to have visited Ukraine and have given the support to President Zelensky. What do you make of that? Is that because of the fact that they want to show support for Zelensky, or are they there to actually talk about other things, given the fact that we're looking at, as you mentioned, the defeat so far, at this point in time anyways, on the ground of Ukrainian forces?
Yeah, it's, of course, there's a brave face, and of course they want to show support. This is the outward appearance of these talks, but I can't believe they converged on Kiev just for that, because they have been showing support. There has been this, show of unity from NATO from the beginning of this war. They've all put in a huge amount of money. All 3 of those countries, to greater degrees of enthusiasm, have provided arms, including howitzers and multiple rocket systems. They're all been doing that. So why they came to Kiev, I think, is to sound out the prospects of peace. I wasn't aware that any secret talks are taking place, but I wouldn't be surprised if they are, because you hear on all sides, it's not just in the United States, it's not just Henry Kissinger suggesting this. It's coming from many, many directions, and it can only be precipitated by a dire assessment of how things are going there in the Donbass. And as I said, if you can throw as much money and heavy equipment across the Polish border as you like, the problem is manpower, and the bulk of Ukraine's regular forces, NATO-trained forces, are there in the Donbass, and they are the ones getting ground down and suffering these horrific casualties. It's not clear who to believe, but even Ukrainian sources are now saying it's up to 1,000 men a day killed and wounded. Ukraine cannot sustain those losses. And I don't believe, given the nature of the war at this point, mainly an artillery storm, that Russian losses are anything near as dire. Although in the first month of the war, they were pretty bad.
Okay. Well, given that, then John Bosnitch, tell us, if you can tell us what is going on when it comes to the different dynamics here, of which you have the Ukrainian President Zelensky saying, we need more weapons, we need more aid, military aid, and you're getting the enthusiasm from the U.S. leading the pack with its $1 billion announcement, and then you have these three European leaders who are also vowing support. But yet facts, and as our guest there, Moscow, indicated, show that they're suffering such heavy losses. The equipment doesn't seem to equal success for the Ukrainian army. So why is this war continuing then?
Well, it appears that the United States and its military partners in NATO have the objective of trying to extend the war as long as they can. That might be a reasonable policy if we were in September, and they would be trying to push the conflict into the colder weather of the later fall. It makes no sense in the first half of June. There is no way that the conflict can be stretched out through the good fighting months of June, July, August into September. And that means that not only is the $40 billion in weaponry not going into proper use, it's being destroyed on the ground as it's being shipped. The wheat is being blocked from export. The train lines by which the alternative of shipping the wheat from Ukraine out to Poland have been interrupted, and the exchange points, the junctions on the train lines have been destroyed. We may be seeing an ultimatum from Western countries that need that wheat, that you must give us the wheat without any financial compensation because we've already given you all of this money in weapons. And that would deprive the Ukrainian economy of its primary cash flow, which would spell the immediate collapse of the Ukrainian domestic economy. In other words, they would not be able to function internally. So this is the crisis that I believe is being discussed now on the borders of Moldova. It seems that the delegation there is at a mid-level, it's not ministerial level, and that there's just an exchange of data and statistics and numbers of captured and the amount of machinery destroyed, military machinery destroyed. From the American point of view, the destruction of their military machinery makes no difference to them because Ukraine owes them the money for that equipment, even if it's destroyed before they can fire shot one out of a weapon that they've been provided with. That money that they owe to the United States will be owed with interest. It probably cannot be paid off in wheat because the wheat cannot be shipped. And it really spells a social collapse, an economic collapse, a full military collapse, and probably the fall or the replacement of Zelensky.
Okay.
That's what we're looking at into July.
All right. Well, let's look at what we're looking at in Donbass, then, Fred Weir. So we could leave this as the last question, so to speak, militarily. The Russians are almost in full control of Donbass. They have a little bit more to go. There is some resistance by the Ukrainian soldiers or forces, even though that's a question mark as to whether how many mercenaries are involved in that operation there. But if they take over Donbass, what indications do you think there is for, in terms of facts, that Russia is going to stop there, or are they going to continue? I mean, are we looking at any signs as to what the Russians may do?
First of all, I think that was too, I guess, pro-Russian optimistic of an assessment. There's still a lot of hard fighting to go. And I, too, have sources mainly here in Russia, military sources and so on. They are pressing forward. They're grinding the Ukrainians down, and they've refined their tactics. But there are many echelons of Ukrainian fortifications. They were building for 8 years. really powerful, defense lines, and they are falling back in good order. I think you have to give the Ukrainians this. They, so far, certainly that army, the NATO-trained army, is fighting very well. They're holding out, and there's maybe a political problem in that they're holding out in places where they're getting surrounded, like Severodonetsk in the Azot factory. Now there are apparently 2,500 Ukrainian troops, including a lot of foreign volunteers, who are now completely surrounded there, just as they were in the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. That's a political problem, something between the ears of Zelensky or the commander Zaluzhny. I suspect Zelensky, who did not permit them to get out of there when they had the chance. So it's a public relations thing at the expense of Ukrainian soldiers, but it drags it out. So they're in that, what they call the Lysychansk agglomeration. There's a lot of weeks of hard fighting to go. They're marching on Slavyansk. There's another node of Ukrainian fortifications, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But that's also going to take a lot of hard fighting. So I wouldn't be so, glib and say that the Donbass is going to fall. It is possible that the Ukrainian army can collapse, or that there can be a political shock in Kiev that will force a change. Wars are always unpredictable, but the way this looks on the ground, mathematically, is weeks and weeks of hard fighting yet to come. And then, see, I steep myself in the war news, so I like to talk about it. But the question is, what then? And what then? I think the negotiations could be on the table. Some kind of talk of peace on the basis of the original Russian demands: Ukrainian neutrality, what they call denazification, which I think means to federalize Ukraine, to give the Russian-speaking regions some measure of autonomy and cultural freedom, and of course the Russians will keep the territory. However far they have advanced, that's how far the territory will be eventually absorbed into the Russian Federation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not too sure where to go, given the little amount of time we have left, and I have to get into the economic side of things here, John Bosnitch. The fact that we're looking at major hits that economies around the world are taking. In particular, we could mention the U.S. and Europe, where in this particular point, the U.S. economy is experiencing its worst inflation in 40 years. You're looking at the rate hike. You're looking at the stock market, where the headline reads 2022 to be the worst year for stock market investors for more than a decade. And of course, whether this inflation is going to be tamed or not is anybody's guess at this point. And Europe, of course, experiencing, I think the Eurozone has the highest inflation on record ever since the euro was adopted. So would the economic consequences push this into a diplomatic quest or not?
Well, that's precisely.
Sorry, go ahead, John Bosnitch.
Go ahead.
No. Sorry about that, Fred Weir. I'll come right back to you. Go ahead.
Sure.
John Bosnitch.
All right. I think that's where we're seeing this go. We're seeing the continuing, and I agree with my fellow commentator here today that yes, it's not a blitzkrieg on the part of the Russian military by any terms, but there is a steadiness of the advance that the Ukrainian troops have come to expect now, and the defections from the Ukrainian side are increasing at a high rate. And this, coupled with the economic pressures, not just on Ukraine, but on the European countries that are prolonging the war by supporting Ukraine, they are suffering the economic hardships now. And their citizens are wondering, why are we suffering economically for a country that we didn't even accept into the EU? And these are a combination of highly sensitive and problematic economic and political questions that are coming home to roost in the capitals of Western Europe.
Fred Weir, the German Chancellor Scholz said that at the moment we are training the Ukrainian military with our most modern weapons, and we've agreed to a trilateral agreement with the US and the UK to deliver rocket launchers. So he says, as you can see, Germany is providing significant support to Ukraine. Isn't that an indication that this war is going to drag out based on this type of execution of training for the Ukrainian military, in this case in point in Germany?
Well, I certainly think that's the PR face of this. I don't think there will be enough weapons or enough Ukrainian soldiers who know how to use them and are able to actually get themselves to the front in good enough time to make the slightest difference to the battles that are going on there now. But on the economic front, if I could quickly put my 2 cents in, this is a kind of perfect storm. I think there was a cyclical crisis building anyway. Then we had the COVID lockdowns and all the disruptions to the supply chains and things that happened. We all remember that. And now this. And it proves that Russia, Ukraine, this part of the world are big sources of commodities. Not just gas and oil, but and grain, but fertilizers, a lot of metals, rare earths, things that are critical to the global economy and which were taken for granted before this perfect storm started to hit. And so indeed, I sit here in Moscow, and there is economic pain here, but it's not. I did my shopping today, cost maybe 15% more than in February, my usual grocery basket. That's bad, but it's not unendurable. All the goods are there. Consumer services are working. Life is normal. We had McDonald's reopened under a new name. So Russia is not really suffering the economic impact.
Sure.
And countries in the West are maybe not worse than Russia, but they're not as used to deprivation as Russians are. But it's strange that the countries dishing out the sanctions have only slightly better economic numbers than Russia itself does.
Yeah, McDonald's always seems to be a gauge not only for the economy, but in this case for the war. We're going to unfortunately have to end it there. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. Fred Weir, journalist and political commentator, and journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnitch from Belgrade. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, commentator, and the team, it's goodbye.